Hello. Today we're going to continue on the series we've been doing this week of the events that happened to Jesus during his last week on earth. Today is Holy Thursday. Some people call it Maundy Thursday, not to be confused with what I used to think it was when I was little, Maundy Thursday. I'll get to it in a little while why it has that particular title. First, I want to tell you where you can find the story of what happened to Jesus on this day. It's in Matthew chapter 26, starting in verse 17, Mark chapter 14, starting in verse 12, Luke chapter 22, starting in verse 7, and then in the Gospel of John, it starts in chapter 13 and goes all the way through chapter 18. You know, there is a lot that happens to Jesus on this day, and I really encourage you to read it for yourself. You can pick one of those gospel passages, or you can read all of them. In it, you'll find things like Jesus praying in the Garden of Gethsemane. He was praying for the disciples and for us. He was arrested. He was put on trial. It's in this passage where Peter denies Jesus. There's so many important things that happened. But I want to concentrate on one specific part, one of the central events that happened on this Thursday, and that's what we call the Last Supper. This is when Jesus first instituted communion for all of his followers for all time. So what I'm going to do is read it and actually lead us in communion, but it gives you a choice. You can either pause the video right now and go get something that you could take communion right now, or maybe you want to listen to the whole video and then tonight maybe set up a time for your whole family to take communion together and maybe light a candle or dress up and make it a little bit of a special evening of worship. So for those of you who want to do it now, I trust you have your things. I've got my bread and I've got my juice. It doesn't have to be something specific, just something to symbolize the whole thing that Jesus was doing with his disciples in the upper room, that first communion. And it says this from the book of Matthew. While they were eating, again talking about Jesus and his best friends, the disciples, Jesus took bread, he gave thanks, and broke it. He gave it to his disciples, saying, "Take and eat. This is my body." Then he took the cup. He gave thanks. And he offered it to them, saying, "Drink from it, all of you. This is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins." It was such an incredibly precious reminder from Jesus to his friends, something that he instituted that they could do from then on. Jesus wasn't going to be around to have communion with them again. He actually says, "I will not drink of this fruit of the vine from now until the day when I drink it anew with you in my Father's kingdom," giving them a promise of what was going to happen, that they would be with him again forever. But until that time comes, Jesus left this as an example, as a reminder. He says, whenever you do this in remembrance of me. So it was a gift that Jesus gave to them, knowing that they were going to be feeling very lost and very sorrowful when he died. And so it was a gift that Jesus gave to them. This passage, I'm going to read the one from Luke. The other thing I want to talk about on this day of Jesus' life is something that for many years I kind of missed, and now it's one of the most important parts to me. In the Luke chapter, in chapter 22, the disciples said, well, they're getting ready to have their celebration of Passover, and It was a big Jewish holiday that they celebrated every year, commemorating when God led them out of slavery in Egypt so many years before. And so they celebrated it every year. And Jesus said to his disciples, "Go and make preparations for us to eat the Passover," something they did every year. And Peter and John said, "Where do you want us to prepare for it?" He replied, "As you enter the city, a man carrying a jar of water will meet you. Follow him to the house that he enters and say to the owner of the house, 'The teacher asks, where is the guest room where I may eat the Passover with my disciples?' He will show you a large upper room, all furnished. Make preparations there." Here's the interesting thing to me. They left, the disciples, and found things just as Jesus had told them. Jesus knew all the little details. He knew exactly what was going to happen, and he let the disciples know. He was helping them plan for the future. He was aware of the most tiny detail. Follow this guy into his house and say these exact words, and everything was ready for them to have this Passover meal together. And I think how wonderful that Jesus was aware. He knew what was coming. He was not surprised. The thing I want to also mention about this is what we see in the book of John 13. It says, "It was just before the Passover feast. Jesus knew that the time had come for him to leave this world and go to the Father." He knew. And why I think that struck me so much now is he's not surprised even now about what is going on in our world. He's not surprised that we're in the middle of a worldwide pandemic. If he was aware during that first communion, that Passover celebration, during his last week of life on earth, he was completely aware and knew what was going to happen. He knew that Judas was going to betray him. He knew that Peter was going to deny him. He knew all those things. And he was trying to help his people be ready. Now here's where the title Maundy Thursday comes in. Again, in the book of John, it has this. Jesus, it's the only gospel that has the story of Jesus washing the disciples' feet. It was the example of the most humble servant leadership Jesus could have come up with. As you probably are aware, in those days with no shoes and no transportation other than their feet or animals, their feet were filthy. And the custom was for the lowest servant to wash everyone's feet before they ate. There wasn't a servant to do that in this particular upper room, and so Jesus took on the servant role and washed their feet. It was an astounding example of serving his friends. And then later, Jesus says, "A new command I give you, love one another as I have loved you. So you must love one another. By this, all men will know that you are my disciples, if you love one another." That command is where they get the name Maundy Thursday. Maundy comes from the Latin word of something, I don't know how to pronounce it, but it means mandate or command. And it's about this command that Jesus gave his disciples. He knew that he was going to die, and he knew how he was going to die. And what he did with this night, this last meal he was going to share with his best friends, was to love them, to serve them, to speak words of comfort to them. He knew what he was going to go through, and he was still loving the people around him, concerned about how they would handle the future when he was killed. And that's the mandate that he gave his disciples and that he gave us. And that little thing, that fact that Jesus was so aware of what was going to happen to him, and what he still did was to love his friends and love his disciples, gives me so much comfort. He knew that this virus was going to come about now. He knew that churches all around the world were going to have to celebrate Easter in their homes instead of celebrating together. Our command, like the command he gave the disciples, is to love one another. And that's how everyone else who sees how the church responds is going to know that we love Jesus and follow him. So as you take communion tonight, or if you are joining in the worship night that we're having online tomorrow night with Alex, just want to encourage you to think about how we can live out that mandate to love one another, to realize that Jesus was fully aware of what was going to happen to him, and he had no fear. That he was completely aware of what is happening with us, and he wants us to remember him through communion, through loving others, and be comforted. So I hope that encourages you. Read through those passages yourself, and remember, Sunday's coming, and Jesus is alive.